Welcome, everyone. This is Tom Campbell of FutureGrasp. We are here today to talk about globalization following coronavirus. And I would like to introduce our esteemed moderator, Geoff Odlum, who is Senior Advisor to FutureGrasp, specifically within the FutureGrasp Foundry. And I'll let him take it from here. And we look forward to an excellent discussion about what might be coming after the pandemic. Go ahead, Geoff.
Thank you, Tom. Good morning, everyone. So on behalf of Dr. Thomas Campbell and FutureGrasp, I'd like to welcome everyone who is joining us this morning for the Zoom fireside chat. As Tom mentioned, my name is Geoff Odlum. I'm a senior advisor with the FutureGrasp Foundry, and I'll be moderating our discussion today. So today we're privileged to have with us Dr. Thomas Campbell, the founder and CEO of FutureGrasp, and Mr. Andrew Hyde, a senior advisor with FutureGrasp. They are going to be discussing the key insights and conclusions from the white paper that FutureGrasp published on Tuesday, March 31st on the urgent topic of globalization following the coronavirus, business as usual, or a new normal. So as the paper notes, our world has obviously changed dramatically in just a few months since the outbreak of COVID-19. We're now facing the most severe threat to global health, the global economy, and potentially even to global stability that we have seen in our lifetimes. Tom Campbell and Andrew Hyde will help clarify for us today how the world is changing and what the situation might look like to the next president of the United States on Inauguration Day in January 2021. It's my honor to introduce these two principal authors. First, Thomas Campbell. Dr. Thomas Campbell is a leading global expert, analyst, writer, and speaker on the subject of how emerging technologies impact national and global security, trade, economics, and geopolitics. Tom's deep career experience as a technologist and as a visionary includes service as the U.S. government's first National Intelligence Officer for Technology at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, as a research associate professor of future technologies and advanced materials at Virginia Tech, as a senior fellow with the Council on Competitiveness in Washington, D.C., and as a special advisor with Bootstrap Labs in Silicon Valley. Tom founded and has been CEO of FutureGrasp since 2017. And prior to the coronavirus outbreak, Tom was more active and in demand on the lecture circuit for AI and security conferences than anyone I know. Joining Tom as principal author of the paper is Andrew Hyde, a recently retired senior diplomat at the U.S. Department of State. Andrew served with great distinction for over 2 decades in a wide range of diplomatic and national security positions overseas and in Washington, including as director and senior advisor in the State Department's International Organizations Bureau, where he advised State Department senior leadership about the United Nations efforts in the areas of peace and security, human rights, humanitarian issues, and economic development. Andrew also served as NATO's Deputy Senior Civilian Representative in Afghanistan, advising the United States, NATO, the United Nations, and the Afghan government about the military and security challenges to promoting Afghan government stability and prospects for forging a durable peace with the Taliban. Andrew currently serves as a senior advisor to the FutureGrasp Foundry, and as a non-resident, his expertise in multilateral diplomacy, peace building, and governance to the Stimson Center's Transforming Conflict and Governance program. So we have 2 very impressive speakers and a really insightful paper. I'm excited to begin the dialogue. Andrew, the webinar stage is yours for some opening comments.
Good morning, Geoff. Thank you very much for moderating. Tom, good to see you. And as I look over the participants list out there, it's good to see some familiar names. So thank you very much for joining us on this Friday for this discussion. I think this is a great opportunity. I appreciate having had the opportunity on the paper to work with Tom. And I think my goal today and just sort of my introductory comments is to really maybe build a bit on it and highlight a few things that folks should be looking at. Really, I think the paper and our webinar today is really meant to be sort of a guidepost for people to think through what's happening. We know how fast things are changing, and what we're thinking today is not what we were thinking a week ago, and inevitably won't be what we're thinking a week from now. But I think there's some useful sort of guideposts that we can identify and use that as a way of initiating discussion here today and maybe going forward. The point of the paper is, as I think everyone who's looked at it knows, is really to talk about how the coronavirus has affected globalization. And in that sense, we touched on the paper, and I'll do it again this morning, just on some of the economics, politics, and international implications. Let me start with the economics, and I know we'll probably get into that in more depth. I think it's clear to me that we haven't reached the bottom yet at all. We really are only starting to see some of the numbers come in, and most real economic indicators that the economists and others rely on to understand and assess what's going on with the economy are by definition lagging to what's actually happening. So things are changing so fast that what we're experiencing now, we won't really see in statistics and other kinds of indicators for a few more weeks. This morning, if you followed the news, of course, we had the first jobs report, formal sort of US federal government jobs report showing 700,000 jobs lost. That seems to have disappointed the stock market to some extent, but to me, it wasn't a surprise at all. And in fact, it represents a survey of the first part of March. So I think the really relevant number has been the number of job applications at the state level here in the US, which is so far, the cumulative amount is over 10 million. Which is unprecedented. I know here in Maryland, they had a 10-time record of applications compared to any time before. So clearly we're in very much uncharted territory. Understandably and necessarily, this has sort of structural and social implications. Societies are recoiling, I think, in many respects, as this begins to take hold, both from the health effects, clearly, social distancing, we're all going through it, we're all experiencing it. But the economic impact and the devastation is really yet to be sort of, I think, internalized and felt within our societies. And so I think that's coming. My hope and my optimistic side says that we'll come out of this stronger and more resilient, but we've got a ways to go, I think, to get there. So right now, I think we're going to be in a situation where we're really more reactionary and more reflexive in our view of things. So what does this mean for politics and political implications? We touch on that in the paper, and I think we cover it fairly well, but clearly we're going to see more nationalism, more internal focus in countries. They're going to be looking at themselves necessarily, both for health, but I also think reassessing how much do we depend on other countries for things, what does interdependence look like in the international world, and sort of what does that mean going forward? It's also obviously reshaping internal politics in many countries. We've seen some governments, the US and the UK government, popularity going up a bit, and that's typical for a crisis. I think people see somebody in charge and taking some degree of responsibility for what's happening and trying to provide answers. You see a bump up in many places. Maybe not as much as you would have seen in other crises, given certain governments and certain actions, but you still see an increased popularity. At this point, of course, I think it's impossible, frankly, to discern the impact of this on the US presidential election. That's still 7 months away. Although I think it's fair to say that the economic implications will not help the current administration and in a bid for re-election. But who knows where we'll be going through the summer and how people will be feeling about wanting to change, wanting a different government in the US. And I think that holds true in many places around the world. I just want to touch briefly on the international system, because I think international system and institutions is something worth watching. The UN is trying to sort of step up and take a role, but the UN can only move as fast as its member states allow it to, I think. And so we have, the Secretary General just the other day pointed out two things in a press conference which are worth sort of repeating. One is, obviously, this is a universal threat facing the world, and all countries are or will be affected by it. And it will have enormous social and economic impact within countries and between countries. And we need to start thinking now and in the future what that will mean for us and how to maybe get ahead of that curve a little bit. Finally, I'll just touch on a couple of areas where I think there is we need to have an international response. We need to think through. Some of it is in the health area, quite obviously. First and foremost, sharing information. We haven't done that perfectly by any means, but it's happening. Research, where do we go with this? I think governments have not stepped up as much as they could have, but the private sector and academics and others are doing a lot there, and I think we should recognize that and appreciate it. Need to look at the humanitarian needs. Refugees in particular, I think that's both a hotbed for infection, but also will exacerbate the refugee situation as the social economic implications go forward. food security, both internally within countries and between countries, something that I think will become increasingly important. And then also peacekeeping. We have an elaborate peacekeeping mechanism through the UN and at other organizations. Peacekeepers themselves, however, are being infected. Their ability to carry out their mission will be hampered, as well as the mission will be changing. So those are just a couple of areas I think that are worth looking at. I'll leave it there at this point, Geoff, and look forward to the questions coming up.
Andrew, thank you very much. Excellent overview of the paper and leaves a lot of food for thought, which we'll dig into shortly. Let me turn it over to Tom for his opening remarks. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Geoff, and thank you, Andrew, for the concise assessment and summary of that section of the white paper. Clearly, our globe is a bit in trouble right now. We just had an announcement just yesterday, in fact, that we had over 1 million confirmed cases of coronavirus with just as of this morning, some 55,000 deaths. It is going up exponentially across the board. In the jargon of technologists, we don't like to see exponentiality of those sorts of things ever. So I'm going to go through a quick summary of the technology and work from home aspects of it. So just before coronavirus pandemic really kicked in, we actually had a trend toward regulation of several of the unicorns from within Silicon Valley, your Facebooks, Apple, Netflix, Amazons, et cetera, Googles. There was a strong trend toward gene editing and AI causing national leadership races. FutureGrasp itself wrote a series of white papers and a large national report with the United Nations on that topic of AI national plans. It's on our website if you'd like to see it. There was massive globalization underway. So one of the things that we're seeing coming into the pandemic itself was trend toward greater interconnectivity. So that is to say 5G, advanced communications within, so advanced countries, telecoms really being ramped up globally. There was also working from home was relatively rare. So what we're all doing right now is, in some ways, we're all kind of guinea pigs for how working from home works. Zoom itself has gone up in its stock price by some almost 150 or 200% in the last 2 months because everybody like ourselves is jumping on Zoom to necessitate our communications. Cyber infrastructure is not necessarily in place for most companies for work from home. And overall, little thought was given to future disruptions other than what various intelligence communities and others within the geopolitics and national government spaces said. So now we're in a situation where we all work from home. If you have children, you're all homeschooling your children. It is a top priority across the board. Unfortunately, that necessitates or causes cybersecurity risks to increase because now you have potentially people not using VPNs, people not using proper cyber hygiene and so forth, companies not necessarily set up to do cybersecurity for work from home scenario. It is putting unprecedented stress on the internet also. Within the white paper, Andrew and I cite, and the team cites a note within one of the recent newspapers in which several of the unicorns have slowed down the speeds by which they transmit their broadband, especially in Europe. They're concerned actually about the internet being compromised as a whole. That's rather unprecedented. And obviously events around the world are being canceled across the board. There is a tracker on one of the websites that we cite within the white paper in which some 45 million people's travel has been disrupted across the board. Borders are sealing worldwide. We have a graphic in the white paper showing that. And it is essentially incredible the number of countries that have basically closed up shop entirely. If you wanted to hop on a plane out of the United States to go abroad, all I can say is good luck. It'll be a bit of a challenge right now, very unfortunately. And as a consequence, airline, travel, tourism industries are in free fall. I mean, if you've been following some of the stock prices in there, and they're just going down and down and down. So as we move into this massive election cycle within the United States and eventually into the next US administration beginning January 20th of 2021, there are going to be lingering and ongoing health concerns. There is talk within the medical community about having a vaccine no earlier than roughly 18 months from now. So it is going to be quite a while before we can get back to, shall we say, business as usual in our forecast. Telecoms obviously are going to need to be treated much more as a national security asset. They are obviously, even before the pandemic, considered a national security asset, but now need to be more prioritized in terms of funding and development. There are many people out there, and particularly as we see with homeschooling, who just don't have internet connectivity, especially if you're in a rural area within the United States and many other places around the world, parts of Africa, India, and other states and continents just don't have that kind of capability. Will travel and tourism be reduced long-term? I suspect, at least for the short term, perhaps the next year or so, it very well might. It's going to take a while to get things back up to speed. And working from home ties are going to be strengthened. So we may not actually look back. There may be a trend actually to diminish the number of global conferences. I myself in the technology community see this. I was joking with my colleagues just the other day. I could sign up for a webinar every second of every day, 24/7 now. There's so much competition in the webinar space. So I'm honored to have everybody join us today for this important discussion. So overall, it's unlikely that normal daily routines are going to be reinstated by the presidential inauguration in next January overall. So we have a couple indicators for health that we called out. These are just mere suggestions. They're probably more, and I'd be happy to discuss with the participants if they have any other ideas or expansions thereupon. The first and foremost is obviously health. There is great discussion right now in the community about the need to flatten the curve. That is to say, to stay home. Don't go out, don't go into large gatherings. It is really interesting that there are several United States which still have not imposed stay-at-home restrictions. I think eventually they're going to have to do that across the board. I personally wish there was a national imposition on stay-at-home, because that will be the only way we can diminish this outbreak. The economy, we have two markers that we call out in the white paper: the stock market and unemployment. As Andrew so clearly stated about unemployment, it is on a tear, unfortunately, right now. There are forecasts from the Fed that we may exceed the depression level unemployment, which in 1933 was 24.9% in 1933, and that took 4 years to get to that point. There is forecast that we may be at 30% unemployment by next month or so. There was a tremendous number of filings, as Andrew clarified. The stock market also has been doing wild gyrations up and down, 1,000 points up and down every day. It is, as of yesterday or so, I believe it was sitting around 22,000, it was touching 30,000 just before the pandemic. So we've lost a lot, essentially trillions of dollars of assets and financial investments have been lost. Global trade, we have unsealed borders as a goal, obviously, exchange of goods returning, trade deal negotiations renewing, and local manufacturing versus import discussions will have to be necessitated. Because essentially within the United States, at least, we had a lot of outsourcing, a lot of dependence upon other countries. And now with all that gone, many of these sectors such as semiconductors, automobiles, anything in the high-tech space has been compromised. And lastly, but not leastly, is escalated debt. So with the necessary stimulus and relief packages being released globally, whether it's by the United States or by the EU or other individual countries, there is going to be additional trillions of dollars of escalated debt on top of what we already had prior to the pandemic. So those are just some summary statements, and I'm happy to take questions and so forth. And I believe Geoff has a few questions to ask of all of us. So I'll cease and desist here right now. And Geoff, you can go ahead and ask us some good questions.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you both, Tom and Andrew, for that very thought-provoking and frankly very sobering analysis of where we are. Because this is a fireside chat or a bookshelf side chat for the benefit of the audience, everyone at home, as you mentioned, I'd like to ask each of the principal authors a few questions, and then bring in our distinguished outside guest speaker for a few questions. But I do want to reserve 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A from the audience, and so we'll try to strictly keep to that timeline. But first, Tom, I want to dig a little bit deeper to follow up on your comment about how the pandemic is leading companies to rethink their dependence on global supply chains. How quickly do you think U.S. companies in different sectors can shorten and diversify their supply chains? And what opportunities and technologies exist to enable potential reshoring of manufacturing to the United States?
Well, overall, I still believe that the United States has incredible manufacturing capabilities. I myself worked in a manufacturing plant for roughly 5 years as a research scientist. way back in the day. Unfortunately, that whole plant was shuttered because it got outsourced. The powers that be decided that they could do it way cheaper over in China. And so all of us were working in that plant, we were outsourced and we moved on. But there are many technologies now that could be better leveraged and expanded toward reshoring of manufacturing. For example, 3D printing can offer reduction of supply chains. It is not a panacea. 3D printing itself can print almost every material known to man now, but getting it to become a very complex 3D print multi-material capability is still a bit of a challenge, but there's intense research, and I myself was very active in research in 3D printing back in the day. So if anybody would like any pointers there, I'm happy to provide them. AI or artificial intelligence can also streamline processes to minimize manufacturing waste, specifically vis-a-vis digitalization of production capabilities. Can point to new opportunities in reshoring. There is intense research being done on that. I'm aware of several startups in Silicon Valley who are all over that, and they should be. So overall, the US government should form greater public-private partnerships to ensure US manufacturing doesn't suffer anymore because of the broken supply chains today. It will not be reliant upon solely the companies. They will not be able to do it on their own. So they will need investments, they will need funding to really kickstart some of the reshoring capabilities, because for any individual company, they probably don't have the resources right now and they're low on cash. So that was what I would implore the US government officials who may be on this call to consider that.
Thank you very much. That's a useful insight. Related to that, you addressed the issue, the new trend towards working from home. I'm curious how sustainable, how enduring you think the working from home trend is. What new infrastructure is needed for work from home capabilities? And can you foresee that some physical conferences might be entirely replaced by online events like this?
So I think that working from home does have great potential to become sustainable, but only with the heavy caveat if greater infrastructure and cybersecurity investments are made within the United States and elsewhere around the world. As we see with Zoom and every other platform I've been on, I've been in 3 webinars, given like 2 or 3 keynotes this week alone myself. You have some dicey connections sometimes, whether it's from your own home system or from somebody else's, or even over the transmission lines themselves. And the software, honestly, still is a little bit clunky. So their basic capabilities, such as fiber optic cables to rural areas, to greater broadband distribution, to more advanced capabilities such as 5G, significant US government investments are needed again. So yes, I can envision that some physical conferences would and can be replaced wholly by online events. It would be challenging if you get into the really large events. So I was supposed to be speaking at a conference in Switzerland, 5,000 event. It's been postponed. I'm not certain how you would run a 5,000 person event online. It would just, maybe the software could be invented. I'm not sure, but that's an opportunity for startup. We as humans, we're very capable, we're very adaptable, but if we don't have the technology necessarily, we need greater investments in fully reliable software, and IT connections will be completely crucial in this context.
I agree, and I think related to that, I think we're going to see a more policy prioritization on 5G, on very effective U.S. government, sorry, U.S. corporate-owned 5G networks. And related to 5G and the competition globally for 5G infrastructure, I'd like to turn to Andrew. Andrew, you suggested in the paper that we may see that China may see the current crisis as an opportune time to redouble its efforts to challenge the U.S. for global leadership and to start reshaping the global order in its favor. What advice would you give today to the President and the Secretary of State, Ambassador Hyde, on how to navigate U.S. relations with China in the aftermath of the pandemic?
Well, I think my main sort of theme of advice would be not to unnecessarily turn it into a conflict or a competition. I think there's a lot of room here for cooperation. That doesn't mean you close your eyes to what their goals might be and what their actions might be. I think that's vitally important for anybody to be in terms of assessing and analyzing what they're doing. But I think reaching out and exhibiting an interest and desire and actually following through for cooperation makes a lot of sense. I think we should remember what our strengths are as a society in the U.S. and in the Western world, and many of those I think play well in this situation: openness, transparency, sharing of information, free flow of information. I think we should approach cooperation with China on that basis. If it is spurned, if it is undermined, then we might need to reconsider. But what I would urge now in this time of need and crisis around the world is that we extend an open hand, not a fist, and try to work together with them.
That sounds like very prudent advice. On the related issue of global cooperation, and given that you're an expert in the United Nations and the UN system, how would you assess the UN and the World Health Organization's effectiveness at sharing information about the outbreak and helping coordinate global response, especially for developing countries who might need the expertise and equipment more than in the developed world? And also, do you think this presents the UN with an opportunity to maybe improve how it handles global health crises in the future? And is that in the US interest? What do you think?
Yeah, all great questions. So I don't think I'm going too far out on a limb to suggest that the UN hasn't done the perfect job. I don't think they could have. I don't think any institution could have. I think we can all sort of see where it could have been better. Part of that is the benefit of hindsight. Part of that is imagining an international order, an institutional arrangement that doesn't actually exist. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, I think the UN is only as good as its member states will allow it to be, which gets to the third part of your question. That said, and the other thing I'll just say is that the UN itself is having to adapt to a very rapidly shifting environment, doing it in cross-cultural setting, doing it in fairly large bureaucracies. So again, I think there's ways to understand, not necessarily to forgive, but to understand what the shortcomings have been. I do think this is an opportunity, however, in those ways, both for the UN to become more nimble, more targeted, and I think member states may be in a position to allow that to happen and will support it with the appropriate resources. I would like to see an international setting in institutions that are still led by member states, but that understands very clearly what its role is, where it can foster that essential cooperation that I mentioned earlier about research, about information sharing, about some degree of economic burden sharing, and can play the appropriate role, the role that I think we intended for it from the beginning back in the 1940s.
Yeah, I think that's I think we all share that goal. I think persuading this current administration to kind of pursue that is one of the challenges, but
yeah, my
hopefully
hope
we'll get there.
Given
that we are at 11:28, I would like, and I have a million more questions to ask the two of you, but I want to leave open the opportunity for the audience to do that. But at this point, I'd love to turn to our distinguished special guest speaker, Professor Greg Treverton. One moment for here we are, thank you. So it's a privilege to welcome Professor Treverton to share his thoughts about the subject. Greg is a former director of RAND's Center for Global Risk and Security, and then former chair of the U.S. government's National Intelligence Council. Professor Treverton is currently a professor at the University of Southern California and a visiting fellow at Sweden's National Defense University. Greg is also chair of the board of the Global TechnoPolitics Forum. And as Greg is a world-class expert in international political economics, political military affairs, terrorism, cybersecurity, and global strategic planning, we're looking forward to hearing his perspectives on the white paper. So, Greg, why don't I start by asking what aspects of the analysis and trend spotting in the paper did you find most persuasive, and on what aspects do you think we might be missing the target a little bit? And in your opinion, what are the 3 or 4 geopolitical issues that the pandemic will most directly impact, and how?
Great, thank you very much, Geoff. It's a great pleasure to be here. Oh, I think am I muted? It is a great pleasure to be here and happy to represent the Global TechnoPolitics Forum in this gathering. Say more about it a bit later. But let me start with the things that are on my mind, the big, as you say, geopolitical consequences of this. So far, obviously economics is driving. We've talked a lot about that, so let me not repeat that. Next on my list would really be America's image in the world. We've looked like the opposite of a leader, not the leader. We've been all over the place. We've also looked unfortunately, surprisingly incompetent. We really did squander 2 months of warning and therefore turned what could have been a relatively minor incident in the United States into something huge, enormous. So that image of not leading and not looking very competent, that's an immediate geopolitical effect that we're obviously going to watch. The counterpart to that, and Andrew talked about China, China has managed a wonderful sleight of hand. Having set this scourge loose, they've now turned themselves into the world model and leader for dealing with it. So a great boon for China. We'll see how long that lasts. It'll depend a lot on what happens to their economy and also to whether or not they really are in the same position that they say they are with respect to new cases. So two biggies are effects on America and effects on China. Next for me would be the rise in authoritarian tendencies. Emergencies are always good for authoritarian leaders. We've seen that in lots of different places. Viktor Orban in Hungary is kind of the poster child for that effect. And I think that will continue as well. The counterpart to that, even for the democratic countries, is that we've had to dramatically enlarge the role of the state. Crises tend to do that, and that's happened as well. Notice the $2 trillion relief fund that the Congress voted. So that combination of increased authoritarianism in authoritarian countries and some increase in the role of the state almost everywhere, those I think are also big effects. Last on my short list would be the rise, and other speakers have mentioned that, the rise of both economic and political nationalism. We saw the economic nationalism everywhere, but probably most obviously in Europe, where partners in the EU closed borders to each other and began to close off critical exports even to their EU partners. The counterpart of that has been, I think will continue to be, a kind of political nationalism that turns into populism, maybe turns into rather ugly scapegoating of immigrants and others. Unfortunately, I think in the short run, those will continue.
Thank you very much. Now, you recently wrote an article for the Hill newspaper on viewing tech giants as a geopolitical force. That was before the coronavirus pandemic really hit the US in full force. But I thought your insights were really interesting. So in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic and the global economic shutdown, how do you see the global tech giants adapting to this? Will they come out of it even more empowered vis-a-vis national governments who were found wanting, frankly, in how they responded to the virus? Or will governments try to use the new normal as an opportunity to impose greater regulatory scrutiny over the tech sector, at least in the US? And what do you think public attitudes will be, let's say in 6 months' time, about the role that Facebook, Amazon, Google, Twitter, et cetera, played in trying to help Americans deal with the stresses of the pandemic?
Great question. I think there are really, for me, two kind of slightly competing trends going on at the same time. On the one hand, I think the tech giants are going to come through this even more salient, even more important. After all, they're, as Tom said, they're the people that are enabling us to work at home and talk to each other and do business at a long distance. So I think they will become much more salient, much more visible, much more important, even than they already are. One of the premises, our premises in starting the Global TechnoPolitics Forum, was precisely that they had sort of lucked into, not sought, but rather lucked into becoming major geopolitical actors, and that we were trying to deal with them with essentially a 20th century toolkit, regulation, penalties, and things like that, when in fact, the right approach is a much more cooperative global conversation. So I hope out of that will come that, because we know that they're going to be under increased scrutiny simply because they're will become even more visible, even more important in the aftermath of the crisis. The other issue that concerns me there is the privacy question. We've noted that even some rather democratic states like South Korea and Israel have instituted social media aided surveillance programs that are pretty intrusive. And my concern there is that just after 9/11, when citizens were quite prepared to yield some privacy in the name of security, my worry is that it will continue to be the case that citizens say, well, I'm willing to yield some privacy if it makes my chances of staying healthy better. So that surveillance and privacy concern, I think, will continue to be very much on my mind.
That's really interesting. That's insightful. That actually tracks with a question I was wanting to ask about whether American citizens, I mean, after 9/11, citizens were frightened enough to be willing to trade privacy for security, or in this case, health security, as you mentioned, and whether you see this as a temporary sacrifice citizens are willing to make or a permanent new fixture of governance by technology. Obviously, the jury's out, but it sounds like in authoritarian states, this is going to be a permanent new, we may see permanent new surveillance infrastructure. Where that balance of security versus privacy lands in the U.S. remains to be seen. But what's your instinct in terms of the coming year?
Yeah, I think that the fear is so great that my fear is that my own fear is that citizens will continue to trade privacy for health. You know, there's a whole new generation of sensors that people could wear. We know, Tom's the technologist, but we know it's very hard to really anonymize any of these sensors, but we can make great advances in health, but at considerable cost to privacy. So that's going to be, I think health really will be the next big frontier about privacy issues. And my concern, as I said, is that I think citizens will continue to be willing to trade privacy for more secure health.
And if I might tack on to Greg's excellent comment there as well, just prior to the pandemic, there was a tremendous trend toward Chinese AI surveillance globally. In fact, we wrote about that within FutureGrasp and tracked with some other colleagues in a sense of data that I think the number was on the order of 40 or 50 countries had adopted Chinese AI surveillance systems as part of their governance capabilities. And so we were actually concerned going in, even before the pandemic, that it was already becoming very, very diverse and very well adopted within the AI surveillance space. So as Greg excellently pointed out, all the capabilities, whether it's a camera pointing at you in a train station or various Wi-Fi tracking systems, your cell phone capabilities being tracked right now, that trend was already there. And I think, as Greg correctly points out, it will be only amplified now. I think people, gloves are off, and if there's a possibility that they can save their lives or their children's or their grandparents' lives by allowing more surveillance, they'll be all for it. I'm not sure we'll be able to go back once the pandemic is over. It may just become sort of a normal state of affairs. So we will see, but it is a grave concern.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you all. Since we have about 25 minutes left, I'd like to spend the next 15 minutes or so taking audience questions, directing it at the most appropriate expert. And as moderator, I will exercise prerogative to ask the questions. We have one question on, do you envision a need, and for the audience, if you have questions, please use the Q&A chat box function at the bottom of the screen. Do you envision a need for national manufacturing and production, a national manufacturing production coordinating body similar to the War Production Board in World War II, to align and coordinate national production and help groom logistical supply chains in the US, presumably? And I open that up to any of you.
Well, maybe I should comment on it first, because I touched about that in a little bit in my opening comments. So clearly, any US government organized initiative would be a good thing right now, as long as it comes with a good plan and good money attached to it. I mean, there have been manufacturing initiatives in the past. The Obama administration, I believe, had 3 or 4 national manufacturing, the NMIs, one of them which was in 3D printing. That was the first one. And they did have some level of success, to be sure. To make them truly a national manufacturing approach is going to have to get the weigh-in of many, many different sectors, many, many different partners, because it's not just a manufacturing plant that you need to worry about, it's all the providers of raw materials all the way out to finished product. And that involves, so if you produce a given, say, automobile, there are thousands of different vendors that are providing the parts and components and software for that. So it will have to be very carefully crafted. I certainly would encourage government to undertake such an initiative, because I think the aspect of reshoring manufacturing is going to become even more critical as this pandemic goes on. I mean, we have seen it already in semiconductor industry, in aircraft industry, in car industry, just massive shutdowns because of sheer lack of parts. And so we're going to have to undertake a very significant uptick in what we consider from the national perspective, if that is a route that the industry is interested in pursuing, which I suspect they at some level would be interested in. Greg,
Let me just say we're also seeing I think an interesting test case right now on the question of ventilators and invoking the Defense Production Act. There you have hesitance, I think, on part of the administration. It's not something they're comfortable doing. They've talked about doing it. There was this effort to have GM and a couple companies start to work on ventilators at enormous expense. It gets back to what Tom just said, though, that it was a lot of the issues were the suppliers for the ventilators, not necessarily putting the ventilators together. But I think it's a very interesting area to watch, because if we do go down that track, we've already learned some lessons from this experience with GM and the administration's hesitance, as I said, about going forward.
Just to tack a word on that, the authorities there, as Andrew says, the Defense Production Act, what's interesting has been that Mr. Trump has been reluctant to use it, called it a last resort. But we know from other sources that basically it's used thousands of times a year by the Pentagon. So the authority is there. And I think, as Tom suggests, there probably is a willingness, especially in this crisis time, for the private sector to want some guidance and some direction. And so I think a much more active use of existing authority makes a lot of sense.
I agree.
Now, here's a question coming in from, I believe, a European viewer. What changes do you envision to the healthcare model in the US as a consequence of the pandemic? Who wants to tackle that one?
Greg, take that one first, maybe.
Sure. And I think it seems to me it almost has to drive in the direction of coverage for all, whether that's an expansion of Obamacare or something else. It seems to me we've seen that we just can't afford to let people lose coverage when they need it most. So my guess, it'll be a messy political process, and exactly how it happens, it'll probably be incremental as it has happened, not Medicare for all, but an extension of things through the Affordable Care Act, my guess is, to make sure that the safety net is there for all Americans, particularly in crises. And a time like this, when people are laid off and may lose their health care with their jobs, that makes it all the more important to have at least a basic national safety net.
And one other element, if I could just add, is that I think what we've seen in the healthcare industry here in the U.S. is a lot of rural hospitals closing, and so patchy healthcare in many states. And I think that'll be something that'll get a renewed look and lead to some of the things that Greg just mentioned.
And one other comment on that note. So one of the things that's not being talked about that I wish was being talked about more is just the healthcare workers themselves. So they are on the front lines of this pandemic right now. Many of them, unfortunately, are catching coronavirus as a result because of lack of PPE, personal protective equipment, and so forth. So coming out of this pandemic, there actually may be a dramatic dearth of healthcare workers. And so we may have to have a national initiative to amplify medical schools, nursing schools, other medical assistant schools in order to replenish, shall we say, that for lack of a better word, that supply of medical workers. And moreover, even have more than the pandemic in the past, because especially in rural communities, if you're out in a rural community, it could take you a half hour to get to a hospital easily. And that should not be the case. We should have doctors that are able to go to specific homes and specific places very easily, as opposed to having to go for long distance to get any care at all. Jeffrey, still there? I think we lost, you're still there. Looking at the Q&A, I suspect, right now. Probably so many questions coming.
I got a little choppy there, sorry, but I thank you for that. That was a good insight. Follow-up question, actually more of a political social question. So also, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes. I think he's frozen.
Okay.
All right.
Can you hear
I'll
me?
look. Yeah. Let me look at the Q&A. I think we may have lost Geoff at some level there. Apologies to everybody there. So I'm sure he's trying to get back on. I'll take a look. Executive order here and take a quick look at the Q&A. So,
Hey, I'm back. Can you hear me?
okay, there he is.
Thank you about that little choppy Wi-Fi for some
As I
reason.
said, we need cyber infrastructure better. So
Exactly. When is 5G
We're a
coming
case-
for
we're a
real?
case
yeah,
in-
I'm just waiting for it.
We're a
Okay,
case in
thank you
point.
for your
Okay,
patience.
continue, Jeff, please.
Okay, the next question is more of a political / social question. With this once in a lifetime shared national crisis that we're living through, will this amplify or diminish political polarization and distrust in the US? And who would be the main driver or determiner of?
We lost you, Jeff. We lost audio on you. Jeff? I think Andrew and Greg got the gist of the question there. So why don't you take it, Andrew? Why don't you go first?
Well, go ahead, Greg. You seem.
My fear is that in the short run, it will only increase polarization. For, as we've seen already, people believe their own set of truths. We still have some people who think this is a hoax and not a big deal. So my worry is in the short run, it will only abet polarization. My hope, and I think this about international cooperation as well, to be more hopeful, I hope in the longer run, people will recognize that we just can't allow this to happen. We can't allow it to happen nationally. We can't allow it to happen internationally. We've known for a long time that our international institutions were not up to the task. They're not fit to accommodate rising powers like China. They don't have a place for empowered individuals and the private sector. And we've learned in this crisis that, as Andrew said earlier, the World Health Organization and the UN really weren't quite up to it. So in the longer run, I hope this will make people say, we just can't do this again. We can't risk it again. And therefore, we've got to fashion new practices and arrangements, both nationally and internationally. That's my longer term hope.
Yeah, I share that, Greg. I do think that you're right in the short term, and I wonder if to some extent social distancing contributes to polarization, because we look at people around us personally and see the other and a risk and a threat. And so that does sort of force you into your own tribe a little more. But I agree with you. I think that ultimately we will take away from this the responses need to be at the community and society level, and that we will need to rely on each other, both in our communities, in our countries, and hopefully, as you say, internationally.
So I think we lost Jeff again there, unfortunately. I'll ask the next question then. So I'm just skimming through them. So one of the questioners asked, what would be the impact of COVID-19 over conflicts around the world, in particular conflict in Syria?
Let me give a slightly more general answer to that. I think we found in the United States, notice that we had to empty a major aircraft carrier.
Yes.
So the implications for conflict, for massing people together, having people together, I think it's going to make us think in the longer run, rethink entirely how we think about warfare. We're not going to be able to have platforms like those big aircraft carriers that were in some sense sitting ducks anyway, good targets, but now they're breeding grounds for all kinds of possible diseases. So I think this will in the longer run change the way we think about going to war or doing war. In the short run, it seems to me it can only deepen Syria's misery. I mean, it's hard to think of things getting worse for Syria, but this is probably one of those that will. We know, I don't think we've now underscored this point enough, we know that the major part of the damage of this pandemic is going to be in the poor countries. Yes, it's going to be bad for us, but we'll get through it. But it could literally decimate. I mean, it could mean that there are parts of Asia and Africa that simply disappear. So I think that's, and sadly, Syria is probably one of the places that will necessarily be hard hit because it doesn't have, it's war torn, it doesn't have the health capability, is sort of a natural, unfortunately, a natural place for very bad things to happen.
One particular aspect, though, in Syria and in some of the other conflicts is I think it might make countries a little more hesitant about involving themselves in other countries. And so you think of the Turkish forces in Syria now, the Russian forces, what they're doing. If there's a risk of infection, if there's a risk of undermining their forces themselves, they may be a little less willing to kind of engage in that. I don't know, what that necessarily means for the Syrian, society. But I think in terms of international involvement, countries will pull back somewhat in what they might do directly.
That's a good point. Interesting.
Geoff, good to have you back.
I found a better room with better Wi-Fi. So, one question I'd wanted to follow up with Tom on, since Tom is, as you mentioned, FutureGrasp, one of the things FutureGrasp has been focusing on has been tracking the other governments' development of national AI strategies and plans, and in fact, offering, advisory services for other governments who want to have a better understanding of how to track national AI strategies and plans. You mentioned that prior to the coronavirus outbreak, some 50 countries in the world are either have already issued or on track to issue national AI strategies and plans. It's a really important trend. AI, machine learning, other emerging technologies that you are tracking will change the nature of the economy and of society. But for governments who are now facing the prospect of social dislocation and economic collapse because of the pandemic, how will this affect the trend in the coming year or two of governments wanting to pursue national AI strategies and plans?
Well, it's a great question, Geoff. Thanks. And so as we see within FutureGrasp and amongst all my colleagues in the United Nations and elsewhere, in essence, the AI national plans will still have importance, but we believe that their development and implementation will obviously be overall tabled for a period of time, as we need an all-hands-on approach by governments to combat coronavirus. I mean, FutureGrasp itself is in discussions with one country in which they are interested in having us advise them regarding their AI national plan, but the last conversation we had with them is, in essence, their whole government is focused on coronavirus right now. So it just will be a delay. But nevertheless, AI will not be sidelined at all. If anything, irrespective of AI national plans, I believe its importance is going to be amplified as we transition to a more digital world. Now with working from home and cybersecurity needs truly becoming paramount to the overall functionality of our economy, how we function as citizens, it's going to be even more important than even before the pandemic. So one thing that I've seen in Wall Street Journal and a few other reporting places is that one of the few industries which will not have a diminishment of employment is in AI. And that's because of this exact reason. And so the AI national plans will still be of paramount importance from a nation state perspective. We may not be working on them quite as aggressively as prior to the pandemic, but I believe states will still recognize that, hey, this is a very seriously important topic, just like 5G and cybersecurity and some of the other Internet of Things digitalization aspects will be. And so they will still tremendously invest in it, and investments are not slowing down in the AI space within industry itself, as far as I know.
That's encouraging to hear, both for the future of technology and for FutureGraph's own mission. It's 11:52, and so what I would propose, we had a number of good questions from our colleagues and friends out there. I've actually lost the window for the Q&A chat. I was going to ask one from Oliver John, one from Orrin McCarthy, and one from George Odlum, but I frankly, in the interest of time, and because I've lost the Q&A window in my Wi-Fi glitch, why don't I, as moderator, give each of you a final 2 minutes, starting with Greg, then Andrew, and then Tom, a final 2 minutes for what is the thought you want to leave the audience with in terms of preparing for the worst yet to come, and then getting through it, and we're finding ourselves, hopefully in 6 months or 1 year, looking back on this as something that it was a shared collective experience, but we all survived it. What are your final thoughts about where we are, how long it'll take to get there, and how we can help accelerate that?
Well, thanks very much, Geoff. I think one of the things we learn, I hope we learn, is that we really are all in this together, right? And so, and we've talked a lot about how it's going to hit the poor countries even harder than it hits us. It's going to hit us, as we have said, the depression, recession is going to go on longer, I think, than most people expect. So we're going to be hit hard, but other countries are going to be hit much harder. And therefore, the realization, I hope, my longer term hope, is that we'll recognize we're in this together. For instance, it makes no sense for me, from my perspective, for us to be not relieving Iran from some of the sanctions to help them, but also to help us. Because if it doesn't get flattened out in Iran, it's going to come back elsewhere. So the realization, I hope, will come out of this, that we are, in a very real sense, in this all together. And I hope that will lead to rethinking about both domestic and international arrangements. If it doesn't, we will have wasted a terrible tragedy if we haven't learned enough from it to recognize that essential unity of all of us and the need to build more cooperative arrangements both locally, nationally, and globally.
Andrew, what do you think? Over to you.
Thank you, Geoff. Yeah, I think this has really been a very helpful discussion, and I really appreciate the questions and the comments from my other fellow panelists. I think the important thing really for us is both to understand, as I mentioned in my opening comments, about how fast things are changing, and seek a bit of discipline in my own sort of thinking about the situation as I see it now, and recognizing that by next week and then next month, things will look different and we'll have a different understanding. I just have seen when people have looked back in the last 6 weeks to sort of say, well, what were we thinking 6 weeks ago? That you don't seem to separate out sort of like, well, now we know what we know, so things have changed. So I think there's a degree of discipline and a degree of agility that I hope will come to our thinking in this as we go through this process. Secondly, I'll just say that there are a number of other global priorities that have been going on. And what I worry is that coronavirus has displaced them. Obviously coronavirus and its aftermath will influence them, but I think it's important to not lose sight of a lot of the important things and a lot of important work that's been going on. For one example, I'll just cite the UN Sustainable Development Goals. That's a long-term 15-year process. We're a third of the way through it. There has been a lot of progress in some of them, but I'm concerned, as I think anyone would be, that we've probably slipped back on a number of them with coronavirus. It'll be important to kind of keep on with it, I think, and important to assess what needs to be changing. How do we factor in the lessons from coronavirus to continuing to make progress in those important areas? Thank you.
Great comments, Greg and Andrew, and super appreciate both of you joining, especially Greg from California there. So my closing comment is I want to do a little bit of an optimistic spin on all this. So one thing that I've been hearing a lot about in social media and so forth is people are not leveraging their time well enough. So I think this is actually, for lack of a better thing to do, it's a great time to become more innovative. So the classic sort of joke example that's being bandied around in the tech news is, why can't I have my Isaac Newton moment? Isaac Newton had to escape to a family farm during the bubonic plague, and during that time he wrote Principia Mathematica and came up with 3 Newton's laws. So there is a great opportunity for all of us to, if you're in a business, create a new business vertical. If you're in a government, come up with some new way of operating the government more efficiently or more effectively. If you're in a school system, come up with a better way of communicating. These are all opportunities for us. So I don't want to always be dystopian or we're all going to be suffering and so forth, because there could be ways to spin this so you could perhaps come out better out of this pandemic than you were before. So that's my closing, somewhat slightly optimistic comment. Obviously, we need to get through all this, and there will be tremendous numbers of people suffering. I think Greg and Andrew are spot on in their comments about Africa and India and some of the Southeast Asia countries are going to suffer tremendously. And that's one of my gravest concerns, is that we're going to lose a lot of really great people are going to suffer in the context, unfortunately, too.
Geoff, you're muted.
You're muted, Geoff.
You're on.
We appreciate the audience's participation and very good questions and forbearance as we deal with technical issues. Thank you again, Greg and Andrew and Tom, for taking your time to share with us your brilliant insights about the impacts of coronavirus on globalization. Hopefully this will be the first of a number of fireside or bookside chats we have. Again, final word to Tom, if you have a final word. Otherwise, we will bid everybody goodbye and stay safe and wash your hands.
So yes, I would like to do a final word if I can get my PowerPoint slides up here real quick. So I just want to say one last comment about FutureGrasp as a company. Those not familiar with it, we formed FutureGrasp back in 2017. We have an amazing team. It's a super honor for myself as an individual to be working with all the fantastic individuals. Those not represented here are John Fetzer, who's on the call as well. He's executive advisor here in Denver, serial entrepreneur, and Erin Keneally, a senior advisor. She's based in Oregon and works as a cybersecurity lawyer there. So FutureGrasp Foundry team, we are available to offer a range of services for corporate government clients, including written thought products, expert briefs, and the sorts of things that you're seeing us do here. So if anybody has a specific need, you can feel free to reach out to me at the info@futuregrasp.com and also the website there. Greg also runs a outstanding forum, the Global TechnoPolitics Forum. I know he didn't get a chance to speak about that, but he has a website up there. We'll be happy to share that as well. And so, as Greg said, and I think we're all in this together, it's going to not be an easy thing to get all through all this. And so hopefully this webinar was of some utility to everybody to think about outside the box a little bit about what might be needed to continue our human society. And thank you again to Geoff for all the excellent moderation, and Andrew and Greg for the outstanding comments. And I hope everybody has a good day, as good as you can make it, given the situation today. So thank you very much.